And good morning, listeners, and welcome back to Sacred Space 102 FM. My name is Shane Ambrose. Delighted to have you here this morning with us here on West Limerick 102. So this morning we are going to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, and we are going all the way to the diocese of Wichita in the US of A, and we're talking to Fr John Hotze. Good morning, Fr John. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Right, so the first thing I have to ask you is, where are you?
The Diocese of Wichita is the southeast corner, or the southeast quarter of the state of Kansas. If you think of the United States, if you just put a pin right in the middle of the United States, that's pretty close to where we're at.
Very good, very good. We're delighted to have you on the program this morning. And the reason we're heading all the way across the Atlantic this morning to have this conversation is we're talking about an interesting gentleman who was in the news recently in the US of A. And that is a man that is called Fr Emil Kapaun. And Fr Emil is from Kansas, he's from the diocese, and he's an interesting story that Fr John is going to talk to us about this morning. Now, the reason he popped up on my news feed is, of course, that his remains were recently recovered because he was... well, Fr John, why don't you tell us his story? Who is Emil Kapaun, and why are we interested in hearing about him this morning?
All right, great. Father Emil Kapaun was a priest of the Diocese of Wichita. And if I'll start at the end, or what we've just been working on now. He was a chaplain in the Korean conflict, and he passed away in a prisoner of war camp in 1951. And at first we believed that his remains were buried in a mass grave along the Yalu River, which is the river that separates North Korea and China. We have since found, or while we were investigating his life, some things came to light. And we found out that he was not buried in one of these mass graves, that he was buried away from that. And then we started to investigate that, and we found out that his remains could very well be back in the United States, that they had been returned to the United States after the war, and that he could be buried in what is called the Punch Bowl, which is a national cemetery in Honolulu, Hawaii. A military cemetery. So we started doing an investigation, and the government, Department of Defense, has been working trying to identify unknown soldiers that are interred there at this national cemetery. And it just so happened that they found Father Kapaun's remains in the cemetery. So this is 70 years after he passed away that we found his remains, and that he'll be returning back to Kansas.
Now, okay, the U.S. has a very strong tradition, particularly in its military, of they don't leave anyone behind, and particularly for those that are called MIA, missing in action. So in one sense, the fact that, Father Kapaun's remains have been found and are being brought home to Kansas is great. But I suppose my listeners are going to be sitting there this morning and they're going to be saying, so what has that got to do with me sitting in West Limerick? What's the big deal?
The big deal is Father Kapaun, I believe, is a perfect saint for our times. When you look at his life, when you look at what he did, we see that he died in service to his fellow prisoners in the prisoner of war camp. But you can't just look at that as his life. He lived his entire life in service to others. One of the men that I interviewed while investigating his cause for canonization was a man named Phil O'Brien, who worked for the Department of Defense. And his task was to identify everybody that had died in this prisoner of war camp. In this prisoner of war camp, there were 3,000 people that were interred there, and 1,600 of them died. So that was 65% of them died in the prisoner of war camp. So he literally interviewed everybody that he could find that was alive from the prisoner of war camp to try to determine who was there. And this Phil O'Brien is not a Catholic. And he started hearing stories about Father Kapaun and his service to his fellow men in the POW camp. And when I first started to interview him, he said, Father Hotze, I'm not a Catholic, but I do believe that if there's anybody that is a saint, it's Father Kapaun. because of the amazing things he did in the prisoner of war camp. But I said to him then, I said, well, he did do amazing things in the POW camp, but I think you have to look at his life earlier, because he began his service well before the prisoner of war camp. He began his service when he was ordained a priest, but then you can say he began his service when he was growing up there in the small town of Pilsen, Kansas, as he would ride his bike to go serve Mass at his local church. He was of service on the farm when he grew up. He grew up in the 1920s and 1930s here in the United States, which was in the midst of the Great Depression. So he spent his time building, for example, building a chicken coop so that they could raise chickens, so that they could have eggs for his family, so that he could supply their neighbors with eggs. He was just an all-around good guy. And when you look at what he did, and you look at his humble beginnings, you see that he did all of this and had nothing. He has received the Medal of Honor, which is the highest honor that the military pays to any man. We just received word that he's going to receive the equivalent of the Medal of Honor from the South Korean government in July. And so we see the great things that he did, the great things that he's being acknowledged for. And he was just a Kansas farm boy.
I love the way you said that. He was just a Kansas farm boy. And I suppose that for me is one of the kings about this story, which really strikes me about it. Because like you said, you know, in a technical sense, what we're saying is the diocese is saying to the church, this is a man who could be a saint and an example for the world. So at the moment we're going through the formal process that the church has for deciding if a person is a saint. So at the moment, Father Kapaun is what we call, is it a servant of God?
He's a servant
of God, right? And then the next step is venerable, then beatification, where you're declared a blessed, and then canonization, where you're declared a saint. So from an Irish perspective, if people were trying to figure out servant of God, well, who's that? In an Irish context, current examples there at the moment would be Frank Duff, the founder of the Legion of Mary. So they'll be on the same step in terms of the overall process. Right. But in terms of it, Father Kapaun's story, I love that idea that simple farm boy who became a priest and went on to serve in the US military. Now, of course, it's an interesting thing. In military sense, it's slightly different between Ireland and the US, because in Ireland, our chaplains are chaplains to the forces. That's their rank. But in the US, the chaplains are actually ranked. They carry rank in the U.S. Army. So he was serving. When did he join up?
Well, he first served in World War II. He served in India and Burma in World War II. And then after World War II, he came back home to the United States. The bishop had him go and study at Catholic University of America, where he got a degree in history and a degree in education. So then he came back and he was assigned as pastor of his home parish. But then the military sent out a call and asked for chaplains to consider to re-enlist, because they were short of chaplains, especially when things started to happen over in the Far East and in Korea. They looked like they seemed that they were going to have some needs. So Father Kapaun asked the bishop if he could return to the military. At first, the bishop ignored him, and Father Kapaun didn't let that stop him. So he asked about 6 months later, and finally the bishop acquiesced and told him that he could go back to this service. Just one interesting story. When he rejoined the service or rejoined the military, he was sent to Fort Bliss, Texas. And Fort Bliss is in West Texas, which is basically desert area. The base most of the base had been closed after World War II. So he was assigned to a little cabin to live in. They said that the dirt or dust in his cabin was knee high. So he literally had to dig out the cabin to go into. But anyway, as he was assigned back there, a man named Ozra Barkley was drafted again, or he was called back into service. And when he got to Fort Bliss, Texas, he was told that he was going to have to bunk with a Catholic chaplain. And Ozra was an Episcopalian. And he said no, that he wouldn't do it. And they told him, they said, well, we don't have any other place. He said, you're either bunking with the Catholic chaplain, or you're going to or you're going to sleep in the gutter. So he said he resigned himself, and he went to the cabin. He said he opened the door to the cabin, and he said what was staring him in the face but a huge picture of the Virgin Mary. So he thought, what have I gotten myself into? But by the time he did not go to Korea, while Father Capon did. But by the time they left each other, or they were separated, with Father Capon going to Korea, he had brought Ozra into the church, and he'd witnessed his marriage to his Catholic wife, and they were steadfast friends. And I'll go on and continue. At the end of the war, Ozra and his wife were very disappointed when they heard that Father Capon was dead. And Ozra said that he prayed for Father Capon's intercession, thinking that if anybody's in heaven, it's him. When they tried to start a family, they were told that they could not conceive children. That Margaret, his wife, they said that her uterus was folded in such a way that she could not be pregnant or get pregnant. They started praying for Father Kapaun and his intercession, and they had three children. After the third child, the doctor called them into the office and told them that each one of their children was a miracle child, because it was physically impossible for Margaret to get pregnant. And I mean, that was the first real miracle that we were kind of looking into. But unfortunately, all of the records had been burnt in a fire that was there at the hospital. But it just kind of goes to show you the type of man Father Kapaun was I mean, being there for everybody. And that's what he did in the prisoner of war camp. Mm-hmm. It did not matter. I had another Episcopalian man who said it didn't matter if you were Catholic, if you were Protestant, if you were Muslim, if you were Buddhist, or he said everybody wanted to pray with Father Kapaun. And he said when he came by, he was just a holy man. And he said, if he offered, you prayed with him. And he said he got many people through to live through the prisoner of war camp, when it would have been very easy for them just to give up and die. But I have
to say, Father John, just listening to his story, what it reminds me of actually is the example of Maximilian Kolbe. Actually, I can see there's a degree of similarity in terms of the story that's there. It's very inspiring, I suppose. So he went to serve in Korea in 1950. He was part of the 8th Cavalry Regiment of the Army's 1st Cavalry Division, and they were ambushed at the Battle of Unsan on November 2nd in 1950. And he was part of they were captured by, it was the Chinese army at the time, so captured by the enemy. And they were forced to march over 60 miles to a prison camp along the Chinese border in the bitter cold. And along the way, he carried his wounded comrades and encouraged them to do likewise. And because of his bravery of going out to give last rites and attend to the men that were being killed in that battle, he, as you said, he was awarded the Medal of Honor in 2013. So then he spent 7 months in the prison or war camp. And so what do we know, kind of, what was the conditions like? What was he doing with the men to try and that kind of is an example and kind of gives you kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It gives you inspiration that this man is someone that we could look to as a model, as a role model, as a saint.
Okay. Well, when I talk about him serving his fellow POWs, conditions were terrible in the prisoner of war camp. Like I say, 65% of the people, or of the men that were interred there, died. Most of them died because they froze. And most of them died that first winter. They say that it was the coldest winter in Korea in the past 150 years, or since they started keeping track of the temperatures. And in Korea, the wind just comes off of the Siberian plateau, in northern Russia. So it just comes down and follows the peninsula. So temperatures would often be between 30 and 40 degrees below zero. I don't know how to convert that to Celsius.
It's cold. We'll just take it that it's cold.
Yeah, and so he would do what he could to get warm clothes. Many of the soldiers still had summer uniforms. I mean, when you look at the history of the Korean conflict, everybody assumed that the conflict was going to be over before Thanksgiving. So many of them did not have winter clothing. One of the first things that happened when men were captured was the North Koreans and the Chinese would take their shoes because their shoes were so much better than their own. So many of them just had whatever they could find to wrap around their feet to keep their feet from freezing. Conditions were dire at best. They were not given fresh water. They were on a starvation diet. They were given like 50 grams of millet to eat each day, which is probably like a couple handfuls of the seed that they were given to eat. They weren't allowed to build fires to try to cook it or anything. So their bodies would not digest the seed when it wasn't cooked because of the hard shell in it. So not only were they freezing, but they are also starving. Father Kapaun spent his life trying to correct that. I mean, he did what he could to steal food from the bins of the North Koreans and Chinese to feed the men. All of the men I talked to said that he was a man of hope and that he was able to instill hope in them so that they wanted to live, so that they wanted to make it out of the POW camp. A Dr. Essenston that was there, a POW also, explained to me, and he said it was very easy for the men to commit suicide. He said all they had to do to commit suicide was stop picking the lice off of their bodies. And he said if they did not pick the lice off their bodies and out of their clothes every day, he said they would be in bad shape. And he said that's how they committed suicide, was they just did not pick the lice off their body. He said the first day, he said you wouldn't notice anything. He said the second day, they would start to look a little gray or ashen. But he said they're in the prison camp on starvation diets. He said everybody started to look that way. And he said, but on the third day, he said they were just gaunt. And he said they were pale. He said you knew at that time that they had quit picking the lice off their body. But he said it was already too late. He said it was too late. He said, I, as a doctor, couldn't do anything. He said the lice would have taken over and would have taken so much blood from them. He said there is no way they could survive. So he said that's how they committed suicide. And it was very easy for him to do. One of his fellow POWs, a man named Herb Miller, who was the man that he carried this distance to the POW camp, said that he woke up one morning and he said he needed to get up to use the latrine. And he said he pushed the guy on one side of him to get up. And he said that man was dead. He said he was frozen. And he said, so he pushed the guy on the other side. And he said that man was frozen dead also. And he said he got up realizing that if it hadn't been for these two men on either side of him dying, that he would not be alive. So like I say, the conditions were terrible. Father Kapaun would go and help bury the dead as much as he could. When he would do that, he would take the clothes off of those that had died and give the clothes to the men that were freezing to death so that they might be better off. So between trying to provide shelter for them, trying to find food to feed them, trying to find drugs that the doctors could use to help them out as they suffered from dysentery or pneumonia or whatever it is that they were suffering from. He was literally somebody that gave his life for somebody else.
It is an inspiring story. So in terms of where things stand at the moment, Father John, so obviously in terms of the formal process, so it started off, Father Emil has been declared a servant of God, so that means from a church point of view, we're looking into his life, his writings, his personal experiences, the witness testimonies that are there for him. I noticed as well that the diocese just celebrated its 13th Father Kapaun pilgrimage, which just was on recently as well, which finished on, was it last Sunday it finished?
Yeah, last Sunday on Feast of Corpus Christi.
Yeah, so it's every year, hundreds of pilgrims, they walk 60 miles to remember the heroic army chaplain. Because of that, obviously, that walk to the POW camp as well, which is it's a nice one. It ends up at Father Kapaun's home parish in Marion in Kansas. So in terms of this morning, we're just asking you to share his story, and if people wanted to find out more about Father Emil, what could they do?
If they have access to a computer, they can go onto the computer. We have several websites. You can get there through the Diocese of Wichita website, or you can also just go directly to fatherkapaun.org. It's just, I think you can get it to either spelled out FATHER, Father Kapaun, FATHERKAPAUN.org, or also the abbreviated FRKAPAUN.org. There's also several groups. There's a group called Captain's Men, that has information on Father Kapaun's life. They too are on the computer, so that would probably be the easiest way to find out about his life. There's been several books that have been written about him, a variety of ways. Yeah, there's, as you said, the websites are very impressive. The one from the diocese it's nice, simple, easy way to navigate. There's some links and resources, particularly to a small booklet, which is a PDF, as well as some documentary. The Kapaun's main website is quite. They've taken this man to heart. There's podcasts, there's video series, there's the pilgrimage. They also do a podcast. It's called the Foxhole Podcast, which is quite interesting as well. So they've really taken him on board and his cause, and are pushing the message that he has. Father John, we're running, I'm afraid, as always on the program. One of our problems is time, so we're up against the clock. But if I was to say to you this morning, if you were to sum up the story of Father Emil Kapaun for the world today, and in terms of, saints are held up as models and witnesses of the faith, what would you say is the message or the example that Father Emil holds up for us in the modern world? The thing that I've always been impressed with Father Kapaun is going back to what we were talking about, that he's just a Kansas farm boy, and he was born with nothing, had nothing throughout his life. He was able to do great things, miraculous things, with what he'd been given. And I think that is a perfect example, or a perfect sign to each and every one of us, that each and every one of us can be a saint also. Because we have the example of Father Kapaun, who had nothing, and God's will be done. Become a saint. But we have that opportunity before us also. There probably isn't a person listening here on the radio that does not have more than what Father Kapaun did. So if we use our resources as Father Kapaun used his resources, we too can be that saint.
Father John Hotze, thank you so much this morning for joining us all the way from Kansas. We're delighted to have you on the program. So to close out this part of the program, one suggested piece of music that we were given is actually Fate of Our Fathers. So we're going to listen to that now, and then we'll move on to part 3 of the program. Father John, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Faith of our fathers living still, in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whene'er we hear that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, children